Everyone. My name is Julia Caleta. Good evening, everyone. I'm a critical fashion practitioner and sustainable fashion researcher, and today I have a pleasure to moderate this talk as a Fashion Revolution Poland member and representative. And with me, I have Ciara Berry, who's the policy and a campaign manager at Fashion Revolution. She's also an author and lead researcher of annual Fashion Transparency Index, which ranks 250 of the world's largest fashion brands on their social and environmental disclosure in their supply chain and operations. Ciara is also co-leading. She's also co-leading the Good Clothes for Pain campaign. Pay campaign, not pain. Sorry, although I think there is a lot of connection to this word, but we'll have a pleasure to talk about this campaign today as well. And the reason we are meeting today is that in recent weeks, it was brought to our attention that one of the major Polish apparel companies postponed for quite a lot the collection of orders from their suppliers, from more or less 100 suppliers in Bangladesh. And that's why I'm very happy to have Ciara here to ask her actually about if this is a popular purchasing practice. I think yes, but I think it shouldn't work like that, because we know that it affects a lot of people who produce our clothes. So Ciara, my first question after this long introduction is to ask you actually who and how is impacted by such sudden changes in the collection of orders from contractors.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me in that really long introduction. I appreciate that. So I think the main thing I want to get across is, what you've spoken about is a really awful case of supplier and worker order cancellations and suffering on a really, really big scale. But like you said, this isn't actually unusual behavior. And when there's such a lack of transparency with purchasing practices in the fashion industry, even as a researcher in this, that it's really not disclosed so much what is actually goes on. But what we do know is that things like order cancellations, retrospective payments, these underpin unequal power relations in the fashion supply chain, and they are common. So the main thing to say is what happens at fashion brand level. So large fashion brands hold the most power, the most influence, the most money, and the decisions they make to their suppliers ultimately trickle down to the workers. So whether a fashion brand decides to pay fairly, not pay fairly, change her order last minute, all of these decisions, they do trickle down to workers. And yeah, so that's the main thing to remember, is that decisions at fashion brand level trickle down to impact suppliers and they impact workers. So there's three main ways I wanted to look at this different perspectives. So the first one is payment terms. So when fashion brands negotiate prices and decide to pay really low or ask for discounts, suppliers might be forced to not invest in their factories, or they can't afford to invest in things like fire and building safety improvements. So what does that mean for workers? It means unsafe working conditions and being at risk when they're at work of things like fire in the factory. So that's the first one, payments and terms. Another thing I think we need to consider is planning and forecasting. So we know that when fashion brands don't give suppliers enough notice to make their clothes, and they suddenly need lots more items and they need them to be delivered quickly, that trickles down to workers too, because the workers are under lots of pressure to produce really quickly, and that can increase things like excessive overtime, also increase their stress and anxiety. It can even impact, in cases we've seen, of access to toilet breaks and meal breaks. So we often see, particularly with ultra fast fashion brands, to be honest, although lots of segments of the market are responsible, their purchasing terms really protect the fashion brand, because they place very few orders up front, so really small order, and then if it does well, quickly repeat it. We need loads more, and we need it really quickly. And that planning and forecasting can really squeeze workers in all the ways I've just talked about. So stress, anxiety, toilet breaks, excessive overtime, all of these issues impact workers. And third, order cancellation. So we know that when brands cancel orders for clothes that are already made, actually what happens is, and I think a lot of people don't realize, is that suppliers and factories, they front the cost for their materials, for the clothes that they make. So they buy things like fabrics up front, and they often go into debt. They don't have loads of money to pay for this. Often they have to go into debt and buy it on credit. So what that means is they've taken out debt to make these clothes, and they've paid worker wages often. So when a fashion brand then turns around and says, oh, do you know what, we're not selling much, we're going to cancel your orders, those suppliers are left with that debt. And it's just so unfair. And it for workers, what that means is they can again face stress, anxiety, but also really severe poverty, because when they're not, if the supplier stops getting money, they stop paying the workers. And that means workers can't afford things like food, housing, healthcare. And the worker themselves can go into debt just to survive. They might need to take out loans just to feed their families. So it's a pretty grim picture. But I'm just trying to demonstrate that all of these things, whether it's planning, forecasting, cancellations, what else do I talk about? Payment terms, is all trickle down to supplier and ultimately to the worker.
Yeah, that's a great overview of actually all of those complexities behind the delays or anything that it's not with plan when you are ordering such a big production. And for me, what was striking really is that, like, I had no idea, to be honest, that it's so long that the brands are not paying for the clothes produced. So can you tell us a bit more about those purchasing practices? What is the standard in the industry, and what how does it work in terms of like those contracts? And because I remember that there are also that the brand and supplier, they don't kind of sign an equal contract, right?
Yeah, that's right. So really the big thing is the imbalance of power. That kind of, we can talk about individual things like forecasting and payment terms, and these all individual things that are the root causes of the issue in terms of purchasing practicing. But the overarching umbrella and that bigger picture that we need to look at is that imbalance of power. So I was going to introduce the Fashion Transparency Index, but kindly you did that in the introduction. So just very quickly, it's a research report that we put out annually, and it looks at disclosure for the largest fashion brands in the world, 250 of the largest, on things. Oh, thank you very much. There are some of the findings of what they disclose about their environmental and human rights policies, practices, impacts in their own operations and in their supply chain. We look at so many different data points, but including purchasing practices. So you can see some of those on the bottom row there, and dig into the detail of the report. But just some that I'd like to pull out is, like, firstly, what we might be shocked to know is that as customers, we buy and wear new clothes before the fashion brands have even paid the factories that made them. So you and I have parted with our money and paid that fashion brand, but that fashion brand won't yet have paid the factories that make our clothes. So timely payments are a really crucial issue, but our research showed that only 11% of major brands commit to pay suppliers within 60 days of their clothes being shipped from the factories. So at this point, the suppliers have already bought the material, made the clothes and shipped them. And even then, only 11% of brands pay them within 60 days, which is 2 months. Only 11%. The rest of them, we assume, because they don't tell us, we assume they take longer. Another is about order cancellations. So unfortunately, order cancellations are actually really common, and asking for discounts after the contracts have been drawn up are, it's not super unusual. It's, again, a really opaque world where fashion brands aren't disclosing that much. But what we do know is that mass order cancellations in excess of 40 billion US dollars during COVID. And we know that had really devastating impacts on garment workers who not only lost their wages, but faced issues like starvation during a health crisis, like COVID crisis, when factories were shut and they were unable to get a job or another job. So during lockdowns, so factories were not paid for clothes they'd already made, but big fashion brands broke their contracts with suppliers. So they both went into a contract and said, right, the supplier is going to buy the material, make the fabric, and we'll pay them however late they pay them. It's normally in excess of 60 days, but that was the agreement. So the supplier did that. And then the big fashion brand says, okay, we'll pay you in accordance to those terms. But when it came to the crunch, when there were lockdowns of shops and, less orders online and less customers, it wasn't the supplier had done what they'd agreed to, but the fashion brand just said, I'm not going to pay. And we saw that absolutely across the fashion industry with $40 billion worth of order cancellations. But we know that there was so much suffering, but we don't actually know the true extent of it, because again, in our research, as you can see, only 2% of major fashion brands tell us whether they cancel orders and or ask for discounts. So it could be so much more widespread than we know of. And then finally, I just wanted to raise a final point that fashion brands hold suppliers to higher ethical standards than they hold themselves. So we know that suppliers and factories have to prove that they operate in accordance with international labour laws and lots of different standards in order to get these orders from fashion brands. So it's not on the screen here, but a different part of the report says 72% of fashion brands state that their supplier code of conducts and policies are based on credible international standards. So 72% are telling us their suppliers are held to this ethical standard, but only, let me get this figure right, I can't actually see because I can't remember it, but I think it's only 2% do the same for themselves, so have a similar, so it's just this picture of inequality where they hold their suppliers to a much higher standard than they hold themselves, and that suppliers take on the risk, the financial risk, in terms of like getting into debt and buying the materials up front, and the big brands pay them back much later, like more than 60 days in most cases, and even then can choose to just cancel and break their side of the contract.
Yeah, this is really this is unbelievable. I mean, like we know about those practices. It works for so many years like that, right? And then it's still as standard in the industry. And what I think is very crucial for us in Fashion Revolution is to make those brands accountable for actually their actions, right? And for treating everyone in the supply chain right. And as you said, this trickled down to workers who are the most vulnerable groups. And I was wondering if you can also tell us a bit more about what kind of a regulation we would need, and like how can we change this, because this is like, these are agreements, these are contracts, this is huge industry that operates like that. So I imagine it's like a huge ship, which is very hard to just like turn with one move. But could you? I think that maybe we could jump to the good clothes for pay campaign. But before the campaign, like what can we do to change this?
Yeah, so you're right that there's so many different changes at different levels. So I'd like to speak about maybe like what it looks like for workers, what it looks like for suppliers, what it looks like for customers, because I think there's different ways we can approach it, right? It's not one size fits all. But I think one thing that just came to my head as you spoke is like, I often hear like online and at conferences and in my work, people go, oh, the supply chain is broken, or like the fashion industry, the fashion system is broken. And I often think, actually, well, it's, by the way, I didn't come up with this. I think I read it somewhere, so I can't take the credit, but it's actually working perfectly for the people that have the power and the money. So it's not that it's broken. It's doing exactly what it's been designed to do, which is put all of the risk on suppliers, put all of the financial risk on suppliers and workers, and protect the fashion brands. But we do need really systemic change, because it's not about one fashion brand. It's actually about the whole system. So I think, there's just if I could wave magic wand, there's so many things I do. Firstly, for suppliers and factories, I think they need more support financially up front to buy the materials. So things like, payment up front so that they can buy the fabrics rather than go into debt, to be paid on time and with fair conditions, and to have lots of legal protections against things like order cancellations, to make sure that's actually outlawed internationally so that that can't happen to them. And to be empowered to stand up to fashion brands and to be able to say, actually, no, we can't make it in 2 days and turn it around, because that would mean for my workers, no breaks, excessive overtime. I think often, like speaking to suppliers, which we do regularly, they're, all of the power sits with the fashion brand, and they're very reliant on those orders in order to to make any money and to pay their workers. And what that means is they just can't say no. If they say, we want the order change at the last minute, or we want this many more, or just unreasonable requests, they need to be able to say no to the fashion brand. And it needs to be more of a partnership, that they're in partnership with each other, rather than we just have to do whatever the fashion brand says, because that imbalance is really difficult. So that would be my supplier and factories level. I think for garment workers, something we talk about a lot is collective bargaining power and unionization. So being able, freedom to associate. So being able to join trade unions and negotiate better pay, better conditions, and have a seat at that table to say, this is how much I need to live on. These are the wages I want. And if they're not receiving that, to be able to walk out en masse, because that's going to hit the fashion brands hard. Is if fashion brands don't have a product without the people who make our clothes. They are the backbone of the industry and of all the money. And so that if they can collectively come together and say, look, we are producing you massive profits, so those collective bargaining rights, that freedom to associate and to join trade unions, I think is really important, because we have to remember that suppliers need workers, fashion brands need workers. Without workers, there is no fashion. So I think the how we get there with freedom of association rights and with the rights for suppliers and about order cancellations is through legislation. We've had years and years and years, decades of voluntary measures, and things are getting worse, not better. Like in our research, we're showing that the gap between what a worker earns and what a living wage is growing. So voluntary measures are not going to work on their own. And I can talk later about the Good Clothes Fair pay campaign. But in the meantime, just in case any fashion brands are listening, I doubt they are, but if it does get sent to them, if you know someone, send it to them. Please do it now. Like, you don't need to wait for legislation. You don't need to wait for laws that make you do this. There are so many things that you can do now to improve your purchasing practices and do it voluntarily. I don't think we can wait for voluntary measures, and I do want laws to make everyone do it. But in the meantime, if you have a position of power, what I'd say to brands is do things like, in the UK, we have something called the voluntary standard, where people sign up and say, I will pay suppliers within 60 days. And in our research, only 11% of fashion brands sign that. So I want much more. I want 100% of the brands that we look at to do that. And, I'm fighting for legislation that requires that. But in the meantime, I'd love to see these fashion brands step up. I'm aware I've been talking for a long time, but my final one is about individuals or customers. And I often get asked a question. I know, Julia, we spoke about this actually, about, well, we often get asked, what about affordability? And, it's a cost of living crisis. And how can people afford? What if people can only afford cheap clothing? So first of all, nobody, and I mean nobody, I've ever met in the slow fashion community is criticizing anyone who's on the poverty line themselves or just below the poverty line, who are, buying cheap clothing from cheap brands that they need for themselves and their families. If you're buying what you need and that's all you can afford, nobody in the slow fashion community is criticizing you. In fact, we just want to reach out in solidarity to you, because we want people who make our clothes to be paid fairly, and we want the people who buy clothes to be paid fairly. And actually, where we're putting we want big fashion brands and governments to step up and do better. And that's things like enforcing better laws, not coming after individuals who have no other choice. But the other thing to say is, actually, there's heaps and heaps of money and power in the fashion industry. Billions and billions of dollars are turned over, and it's not people on the poverty line who are only buying what they can afford that make these massive profits for fashion industries. So I do think we need to think about mass consumption and the middle classes who are buying too much clothing, whether that's high street or high end. So, usually we had this conversation, didn't we? And we said we're happy to have a conversation about affordability of clothes, but we have to centre and uplift the voices of the people who make the clothes. They have to be in that affordability conversation. So yes, we can say, what does affordability look like in terms of clothing? But we also need to say, well, do the people who make those clothes, can they afford their basic needs? Can they feed their families? Can they, live in decent housing? So I think we can have a conversation about affordability, but only if we also speak about the people who make our clothes.
Yeah. I'm very actually happy that you brought back this subject also in this conversation, because just before we go to the Good Clothes Fair pay, which is really connected to what you're just saying, right? Because it's about giving a right, giving supporting the most vulnerable groups, which are often those women who produce clothes, and these are the group that cannot afford even those cheap clothing that they are producing, right?
Yeah.
And this is crazy. And also what you said, I really like what you said about the supply chain is being broken. Indeed, like if we look from the perspective of people who designed it, who designed planned obsolescence of the product, right? So, and the psychology of trends that you can just buy, you are incentivized to buy more and more. Then you can really say that the supply chain works perfectly because it brings
it's great.
a huge benefit for those people who want this benefit and constant growth, right? But now we can see that this is not now. It's not now we can see it for many, many years now. But indeed, my just last thought on that is that I really just kind of, when we talk, I just picture this thing that we here in Europe, we can go to the store, buy clothes, we can afford them, and then we also order online. We just have a one click, and we live in this the culture of like convenience, right? So we expect the clothes to be sent in 2-3 days. The people who work in those brands, but again on those higher level positions, on chairs or even designers, they also are paid monthly, and they're expecting to get their pay on time. But the people who make those clothes, they are not being paid for many months. And still, this is also what affects the liquidity of the suppliers, right? So, that way, this is what's broken, because it's like this power system.
And also, adding to what you said, is like they don't get paid for months if there's order cancellations. And these are the people with the least savings. We know they don't earn living wages. So it's not about, are they saving? Are they being financially responsible? They have no capacity to save because they earn so little, even when they are earning. That, they're below a living wage rate. So they're living hand to mouth. They can't save because there's not enough money to save on their wages. So when they're not paid for months, it's such a dire situation, because it's not, I'm in a position of relative privilege. So if I lost my job, I might have a small amount of savings and be able to look for another job. That isn't the position they find themselves in. And also, all these things intersect and compound, because not only do they not have savings, so they're more stuck when they don't get their wages for months, they're disproportionately in areas of the global south that are more impacted by the climate crisis. So they're more likely to face natural hazards like floods, like cyclones, they contribute the least to the climate crisis, but they're right on the front lines of dealing with it. So right now, about a third of Pakistan is underwater. So they're climate refugees fleeing without any savings. And I think this grim picture is the reality that we need to just be honest about, which is that's what we're compromising when we're talking about affordability of clothes. Unless we're talking about those workers, then this is the reality.
That's also a very important factor to add. How are they impact, who and how is impacted by this kind of delay? So that's like a question that we departed from, right? And I think that now I really would like to move to the subject of the campaign that you launched in July, as I remember correctly. And yes, if you could tell us more about the campaign. I have this slide about like already more detailed about this legislation. But maybe if you could just like tell us a bit more, because it's connected to what you said, that the people who work in the workers who are making our clothes, they even don't have possibility to save, right? So we were campaigning for actually the living wage, which is more than a minimum wage, but wage that allows women, mostly women who works, to also save money and be able to pay for a school for the kids and have a decent housing. Am I right?
Yes, you're right. So I think a lot of people conflate the terms minimum wage and living wage. So most workers earn minimum wages, which we actually call poverty wages, because in most places where our clothes are made, legal minimum wages are simply not enough for workers to live on. And that's why we see so many of them work really excessive overtime and really long hours just to make ends meet, because in 40 hours a week on minimum wages, they can't meet their basic needs. So at Fashion Revolution, we believe there is no sustainable fashion without fair pay. You can't talk about sustainable clothes if the people who made them are trapped in poverty. But right now, that is the reality. So most people who make our clothes, like you said, mainly young women of colour, earn so little that they cannot afford to do things like eat healthy food, go to the doctor, live in adequate housing. They even struggle to send their children to school. So what we're looking for is living wages. And a living wage is a basic but decent standard of life where you could meet those costs for yourselves and your family. So we're running a campaign called Good Clothes Fair Pay, and we're demanding the first of its kind EU legislation on living wages for garment workers worldwide. And you can go to our website, which is goodclothesfairpay.eu. I think it's on screen there. Thank you. And please sign if you care about these issues, if you care about the people who make your clothes, if you want systemic change in the fashion industry, please support us. We need 1 million signatures by July next year. And we can't get signatures in the UK, for example, where I live, because most people don't have EU passports. So we really would love to get some Polish signatures and to increase the signatures there. It's not just a normal petition with no defined outcome. That's so important to say. If it's a specific mechanism at EU level where if we get 1 million signatures, the EU have to respond to our legal proposal, and they have to formally respond to us and consider bringing it in. So it's really, we really could change the law here and really improve things. And I get very excited about talking about it, and there's obviously information on screen, but all of the issues we spoke about it addresses. So first, our draft legislation, as we've written it, requires, number one, living wages. Fashion brands would be required to do due diligence on the wages that chain, tell us what that is, so be transparent about it and close the gap. And they'd have to keep reporting what is the lowest wage worker paid, and they'd have to close that gap. It would also make fair payment terms in EU law. So it would require things like 60-day payments at an absolute maximum, and it would make it illegal to do things like order cancellations. It would really strengthen workers' freedom of association. So we spoke earlier about their right to come together and collectively bargain for better pay and better conditions. This would empower the worker to have better freedom of association. And finally, another aspect of the law is about transparency. So there's really strict transparency requirements in there. I mean, you'll know, Yulia, like at Fashion Revolution, if you don't know where your clothes are made and in what conditions, you can't prevent tragedies like Rana Plaza, like a factory collapse. You have to map and know where your clothes are being made. And that's where the transparency requirements are really important. So it would be things like where their clothes are being made, but also tell us what conditions. So what's the lowest take-home pay for every worker in your factory? So I really encourage everyone watching, everyone interested, please go to goodclothesfairpay.eu, sign your name and send it to your friends and family. And together we can bring in this legislation that we would lift 70 million, mainly young women of colour, out of poverty, and it'd be really transformative.
Wow, yeah, so thank you, Ciara, because it sounds like this is really important campaign, and this is really important document, or like a proposal that we have a chance to ask you, Parliament, to look into and to bring it to light, because then, as I understand, this would actually really hold this kind of brands accountable for not delaying or not postponing or not leaving the suppliers without picked up orders, right?
Absolutely. They legally couldn't cancel orders, which would be an absolute game changer. It would really change the fashion system, and it's really ambitious. We've written exactly the laws we want to see, and we just need to get that support behind us to show the European Commission this is what European citizens want. We want fair pay, fair treatment for the people that make our clothes.
Okay, yes, we want it all. We want it in Fashion Revolution all over the world, because our organization have a lot of countries where we are active. So, but the campaign is for EU citizens, but that means that also if we live like in other continents, but we have a European passport, we can still sign it, right? Because it's an
Yeah, absolutely. So I live in the UK, which sadly isn't part of the EU anymore, but I have an Irish passport, so I can sign. And the other thing to say is, although it's EU legislation, it will affect garment workers worldwide. So it doesn't matter if your supply chain is in Poland or in Bangladesh or in India. It doesn't have to be in the EU. Those workers will still be protected. I think it's so good to end on like a positive, because I think sometimes it can be so negative and the issues are so big you don't even know where to start. But I think this is a really tangible thing. People can go and make a positive difference, and they don't have to spend any money, don't have to buy anything. They can just, this is what we should do this Black Friday, isn't it, Julia? Just sign, don't buy, just sign.
Exactly. Yes, no, you're right. I'm very happy that we got to this this nice insight of that we can actually bring change to the industry. We all hope for that, and we are active in that field to make this change. I'm very grateful that we could chat today about all of those very important and difficult actually matters. So one more time, thank you, Ciara, for explaining everything in such a coherent and deep way in such a short time. One more time, if anyone is interested in the Fashion Transparency Index, it's a resource that you can find on the fashionrevolution.org, as well as the Good Clothes for Pay is the website where you can learn more about the legislative and all of the proposed rights that we want to execute. I think that's all. Thank you so much, Ciara. Thank you everyone for watching, and I hope that you will sign the petition just straight after our talk.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.